As I'm sure many of you are aware, we have been hard at work over here at Envy Ranger & Co., taking a look at the various towns, cities, and even railroads at times, and today is not too dissimilar, but this time we're going to a very different world to check out those cities. We had just finished getting our new West Side office set up, having a bit of coffee, when we got a knock on the door. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but this device and a note. The note included a contract, a very lucrative one at that, and it wanted us to go to a land known as Skyrim on the continent of Tamriel. We'd simply use the device given alongside the contract to get there. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the process, I'm going to go through each city, judge it by a set of categories, and then by the end of the video, we'll have fully ranked all of the cities in order from the best cities to live in and the worst cities to live in. Think of me as your personal real estate agent. I'm gonna help you make a new life for yourself in a foreign land, but keep in mind that you are not the Dragonborn in this scenario. You cannot simply reload a save if you die, so choosing a life of fighting bandits and dragons is a poor decision and only really serves those who choose to work in the Hall of the Dead. I will take us through the 9 different capitals of each of the holds of these lands and judge them based on these qualities. We'll look at the housing. What's the trading like? Is there a water source? Is there a food source? What is the safety and defense of the city like? Who leads the city and what are their qualities? Do they benefit the town or hurt it? What's the community like? Is there a lot of potential for work and what are those options? And then last but not least, what is the weather like, as I'm sure that's relevant to most of us. We will begin our assessment of Skyrim's cities in Dawnstar. Now, Dawnstar's housing situation is quite limited. We'll consider the inns of each town as a part of the housing, so we do have the Wind Peak Inn here, and you can stay in the room, but keep in mind, each night you stay in the room, you have to pay for that, so rent is going to pile up quickly. There is also Heliarchen Hall, which is a property, but the property really isn't close to Dawnstar, so if we're considering living in the city of Dawnstar, this is largely irrelevant. Now, I suppose you could maybe integrate yourself into the community, become a relevant member, and then request the Jarl that you build a home somewhere. But when we take a look at the map, there's not a whole lot of room left open. Maybe you could tuck yourself into this corner right here. Trading is also very limited in Dawnstar. We only really have 2 shops. Now, going forward, keep in mind that each inn does allow a bit of trading with the food that the innkeep has, but there's not a lot there, and we're not going to double count that into trading, so just keep in mind, the inn does have trading, we recognize that, but we're only going to count the shops outside of that. And when it comes to those shops in Dawnstar, we do have Rustleaf, who is a blacksmith, and then you have the Mortar and Pestle, which is an alchemy shop, but unfortunately there is no general goods store. The only towns without one are Dawnstar and Morthal, which we'll get to later, but this is a huge negative for town. It really limits your trading. Is there a water source in Dawnstar? Technically, yes, it is a port city sitting right on the ocean, but unless they've figured out desalination, which there is no proof of, there doesn't seem to be a fresh water source in or around the city, unfortunately. And when it comes to food, there are no farms, so they're likely reliant on things like trading, fishing, or even hunting. Dawnstar is not off to a great start, to be honest, and when it comes to safety and defense, things just seem to keep getting worse. We do have a town that is plagued with nightmares, so when you move here, expect to experience something similar. We also have a particularly high risk of dragon attacks in this town, and they don't have defenses set up to deal with such a thing, so you're at a lot of risk coming here. There's no significant walls. You do have the Dawnstar barracks, so there are guards on site, and we also have a Mythic Dawn museum, so that might bring some trouble to town as well. Of course, walls alone aren't going to deter a dragon attack, but this leaves the town open to other attacks from wildlife or bandits. Not to mention, many of the buildings in town are comprised at least partially, if not fully, of wood. Burning this place down seems quite easy as well. The Jarl of Dawnstar is Skald the Elder, who is a grumpy old guy who really likes Ulfric's Stormcloak, but I think there's something deeper to look into here with Skald, given the state of his town and what we know is currently going on in the region. First of all, the fact that this town is so poorly defended has to lay on somebody's shoulders. We know that dragons are attacking, we know that wildlife and bandits are a danger in Skyrim, so why is Skald the Elder allowing his town to be so exposed? Beyond that, there is a ton of trading opportunity here in Dawnstar. There are 3 northern coast cities in Skyrim. We have Solitude, Dawnstar, and Winterhold. Winterhold does not have a port, and Solitude is entirely aligned with the Empire. So anybody who is directly against the Empire, including the Stormcloaks, could certainly use a port city to work with, but for some reason Dawnstar seems to be suffering greatly when it comes to trade. Again, we're going to look towards the leadership here with Skald. And that brings us to the community and potential for work. Dawnstar is less of a city and more of a small mining village. We have 2 rich mines in the Ironbreaker mine and the Quicksilver mine that sit on nearly opposite ends of town. Beyond that, there is a port, of course. We could fish or hunt horkers maybe, and there are no stables to work at. This also means it costs more to get to this hold from those cities who do have stables. Personally, if I were to pick up a trade in Dawnstar, I would avoid the mines. I wouldn't want to be underground all day. I would prefer to go try and hunt horkers maybe. They're slow, goofy animals, and as long as you can figure out how to work a bow and arrow and stay at a distance, you could probably take these guys out pretty easily, especially when compared to hunting other animals in Skyrim such as elk, which are easily going to outrun you, or bacteria-ridden bears who are going to maul you to death. Nonetheless, your options for work are quite limited here in Dawnstar, and that brings us to the final category of weather. Dawnstar is very cold. Not only is it one of the most northern cities of Skyrim, it is also in a perpetual state of snow and ice. You will likely be stuck in winter here. Now maybe you like that sort of thing, but ultimately I have to consider the other issues with the town as well, so Dawnstar fits squarely into F tier. We have limited housing, lacking trade, no consistent water source or food source aside from horkers potentially, the safety and defense is abysmal, the leadership seems lacking to say the least, and we don't have a lot of work options unless you really like being a miner. Now we can move on to the town of Falkreath. Now again, similar to Dawnstar, this is a smaller town, and the housing options are again limited to largely just the inn. We do have the Lakeview Manor property, which costs you 5,000 gold, but again, it's not close to the town of Falkreath, so not overly relevant. When it comes to trading, we're off to a better start with at least one more shop here. We have 3 shops in total: Grave Concoctions, which is an alchemy store, Grey Pine Goods, which gives us that general store, and then once again we have a blacksmith with Lod. Now I'd like to circle back to housing for just a brief moment and consider the potential for building a house. Now of course you have to get integrated into the community, become accepted, and then likely get approval from the Jarl. But if we take a look at this map here, we can see we don't have a whole lot of room to build any additional housing except for maybe this little cliffside up here next to the stream. Might be able to build a nice little fishing cabin up there. That transitions us into the water source, which of course this acts as one. There are fish inside of this pond, and I think this is certainly considered fresh water. For food, we have the Corpse Light Farm, and I would imagine that Falkreath, being in a dense wooded area, also has hunting available as well. For safety and defense, there aren't these large stone walls surrounding it like other larger cities, but we do have some smaller wooden barricades as well that guards can sit at. There are also the Falkreath Barracks, of course, which the guards get to sleep in. Now, when it comes to negatives, we have to consider the fact that there is currently a werewolf in the prison who can very easily escape, no problem, so you might get mauled by him if he has a bit of an outburst. It's also worth considering that Falkreath has been the location of many battles in the past, being the reason it has such a large graveyard. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. We might have another battle here in Falkreath, and you might fall victim to such a thing. For leadership in this town, we have Sidgeir, who is lazy, corrupt. As we know, he colludes with bandits, and he is quite condescending and likely unwilling to take advice or criticism from others. He seems to be a young, pompous, arrogant leader who looks to serve himself before serving his town, if he has any intention on serving them at all. He's really a negative when it comes to Falkreath. For the community, it's a very small city, again more of a village in the forest than a city, but it is the capital of the hold no less, and people seem generally more open and kind than other towns. Maybe that has to do with the weather. When it comes to potential work, we don't have mines like we did in Dawnstar, but we do have the Deadwood Lumber Mill. I'm sure they're always looking for a hand. You also have the Falkreath Graveyard. There are no stables here to work similar to Dawnstar, so that's a bit of an issue. No becoming a stable hand, and then of course you could hunt or fish in the pond next to the mill. It's also worth considering, but can largely be left unsaid as we continue throughout the video. You could take up some sort of apprenticeship or help out one of the shops in town, become an assistant to the alchemist, help out the blacksmith, things like that. When it comes to whether this has to be one of the nicer towns in Skyrim, we have a very nice spring, summertime feel to the place. I'm sure it still gets cool at times though. We do have the potential for dense fog as well, but I would take that over a blizzard. Now we can go ahead and rank Falkreath. So I think something that should have been mentioned perhaps in safety and defense is the enormous amount of trees in the area makes it difficult for a dragon to attack this place, so that's a pretty big positive. There aren't a ton of options for potential work, but I think there's enough. You could maybe even help out at the Corpse Light Farm, which is right in the middle of town, and again, the limited housing is a problem, but the fact that Siggeir is a poor leader, but perhaps a flexible one, that if you help him out, bribe him a little bit, do him some favors, he might allow you to get a place built in town a little bit quicker than some of the other Jarls, so I think we're going to go ahead and put Falkreath in C tier, for now at least. I say this for each of our rankings, but all of these initial rankings are subject to change at the end of the video because everything is sort of relative, so we might have to do a bit of adjusting as we proceed. Our third city brings us to the dwarven remains of Markarth. Now for the housing here, we finally have a purchasable home within the town. Winterhold Hall is going to cost you 8,000 gold up front, plus another 4,000 to get the place furnished, for a total of 12,000. It's not the cheapest place, but it's not the most expensive either. You also have the Silverblood Inn for while you're trying to work up that coin, and then the Warrens, which are largely just slums. Living in the Warrens might be a bit risky, but it will be a low-cost way of living so that you can try and build up that coin as fast as possible and build Winterhold Hall. Now, in-game, you have to usually do a series of quests or meet certain checkpoints so that you're able to buy the housing in each city, but we're just going to assume that if you become a part of the town, a part of the workforce, the Jarl is going to grant you the ability to buy the house from his steward. We do have a bit more trading in Markarth, but it's not all that great to be honest. To start off, we have Arnleif and Sons Trading Company, which is in a really poor state, largely due to Forsworn hurting the trade routes for the city. Nonetheless, they act as a general goods store. We also have the Hag's Cure, which is an alchemy store. You have Gorza Gra Bagul, which is a blacksmith, Hogni Red Arm, which runs the meat stall in the market, and then Kara, who runs a jewelry stall in the market, although I think that she can be murdered during a Forsworn attack when you enter the town. For the water source, luckily we have this beautiful mountain stream that flows through the town into a river. We also have the Salvius Farm just beyond the city walls for food, and then for safety and defense, there's a good bit to consider here. Naturally, it's a well-defended mountainous region of the Reach, and it's tucked within the mountains as well, Markarth that is, so it makes it very difficult for a dragon to attack it. Large walls with good defense positioning, not to mention we also have a Markarth guard tower that acts as a unique barracks. Unfortunately, I could tell from my time in Markarth that the guards seem quite a bit corrupt. They want to brush the Forsworn threat under the rug, although it seems incredibly present. We also have an abandoned home that seems to be possessed by Molag Bal. Not great. It's isolated and it's far away from other cities. There's some pros and cons to that. And again, Forsworn roam the area and believe they should own the city and that it was stolen from them. There is a Forsworn attack in the market with a potential killing upon entering town like we mentioned earlier, but again, it is one of the safest cities from a dragon attack or external threats because of its positioning. The real threats here aren't external, they're internal. We know that the Sidna mines in town are worked by prisoners, and those prisoners are ready to stage a Forsworn rebellion. This is a huge threat. The leadership is Jarl Igmund, but he claims there are no Forsworn in the city, so he is either ignorant or corrupt. He is undermined by the very wealthy Silverblood family, who are corrupt as well, power hungry, and own a significant amount of control. The Jarl is aligned with the Empire, but the Silverbloods are aligned with the Stormcloaks, so you have a direct conflict of interest here, and we also have a Thalmor presence in the city, so the leadership situation is one of conflict and disarray. It doesn't seem to be coming from a single source. And much like the leadership is divided, the community also seems divided. Again, you have the wealthy Silverblood family, but then you have the downtrodden who live in the Warren. You have those who just want to mind their business and their shops, and then you have those living in the Sidna mine women who are forsworn plotting a rebellion. There's a lot of division here, not a whole lot of unity, unfortunately. And while you have this distracted leadership who doesn't want to pay attention to the townsfolk, they're largely becoming more and more afraid of the forsworn threat. The potential for work here is also pretty problematic. You have the Cidhna mine, which could be a great source for work for the people of this town. It's a rich silver mine, but it only uses convict labor, and this is ensured by mercenaries hired by the Silverblood family who own the mine. Beyond that, you have the Markarth lumber mill and forge, although this seems more of a forge than a lumber mill. You have the treasury house, which is ran by the Silverblood family again, so if you're looking for work, you might have to interact with the Silverblood family in some way. Will they want to hire you? Probably not. They don't seem like the most open group. You also have the Markarth stables. Again, we have cheaper travel to this city than the other two that we've discussed before because they don't have stables. You have the Hall of the Dead, which you could work in, and then you have the left-hand iron mine just outside of the town's walls. So you would be lacking a bit in defense out there, but you do have workers' quarters out there, so that would be a benefit in terms of housing. The weather of the Reach seems to be like a decent middle ground when it comes to Skyrim. It's chilly, but largely temperate. It's not super sunny and nice like the potential weathers of Falkreath, but it's nothing like Dawnstar, Windhelm, or Winterhold, these colder locations. With all this considered, let's go ahead and give our ranking for Markarth. Now, I want to note that most of the workers of the Kulskegger mine were killed by Forsworn. This location isn't directly next to Markarth, but it could be a bit of foreshadowing for those working in the left-hand iron mine and just displays the threat that the Forsworn pose to those living in this region and potentially those in this city. We know of the attack that happens in the market when we enter town. We know that the Jarl is largely ignorant to their presence or corrupt. We know that they have an enormous presence in the Cidhna mine and plan to lead a revolt. We do have the Salvius farm, again just beyond the city walls, but this is only one farm to feed the entire city, and it seems like it would be difficult to go out and hunt given that Forsworn presence in the area. You might die out there if you don't get killed in your own city. And let's also consider the fact that you're coming in as an outsider into this town. So let's say another Forsworn attack happens, you might get tied in or implicated in that event even if you had nothing to do with it. So you could have the townsfolk leading a witch hunt against outsiders, and you could have the Forsworn attacking you at your own front door. This is a really, really risky place to live, and I'm having a hard time justifying putting it above Dawnstar even. Yes, you finally have the option to purchase a home in a city, and yes, you're safe from dragons, but do you really want to live in constant paranoia like this? I don't think so. I think what I'm gonna go ahead and do is move Dawnstar up to D tier for now. It might move back down, and I'm gonna put Markarth in F tier. You also have the fact that Molag Bal is currently possessing an abandoned home in town. I know this might surprise some people, but consider how quickly Markarth could turn into a failed city. The Forsworn come in, kill the Salvius farm just outside of the walls because they're not well protected. Then all of a sudden, the townsfolk don't have a direct food source, trade isn't coming through to the city again because of the Forsworn, and you have a city at each other's throats. They're starving all of a sudden, and they're in a really difficult situation, and now escaping the city or leaving just puts you right into the hands of those Forsworn. You also have the fact that Markarth is tucked away and isolated, and many of the other holds are tied up in this civil war and might not have the resources to spare to them. So I feel pretty justified in putting Markarth in F tier for now. We'll see how the other towns stack up. Our next M town takes us to the Drakmir Marsh with Morthal. So the housing here, again, we have another one of those properties, the Winstad Manor, which is $5,000, but we're not within town, so pretty much irrelevant, just like the previous. We do have the Moorside Inn, and I suppose you could rebuild the burnt down house after the little ghost girl gets out of there, or maybe you could just live with her, get some... Yeah, I don't know, maybe don't do that, that's a little weird. There does seem to be some room for growth on the other side of the bridge here. Maybe you could be neighbors to Jorgen and Lammy. Who knows? The trading in Morthal is unfortunately nothing short of abysmal. It might be the worst town in all of the lands when it comes to trading. We have one shop in the Thaumaturgist's Hut, which is an alchemy shop, but we have no market, no general goods store. This is the only other town without one aside from Dawnstar. Beyond that, we have no blacksmith. For our water source, the town is formed around a pond or lake of some sorts. There are boats in it, so we'll give it credit and call it a lake, and it kind of runs into a river after it passes under the bridge. There are no farms in town, so perhaps they're reliant on fishing and trade, although we can see the trade is pretty terrible here. For safety and defense, again, they're located within the Drakmere Marsh, which could provide some positives and negatives. It might make it very difficult to attack the town though, especially with some large force, and they're shrouded in fog, which again, sort of positives and negatives here. They're isolated, and they're able to stay out of most major conflicts. As a result, you do have Fallion the wizard who quietly protects the town, so that's a pretty big benefit. On the downside though, the town is deeply lacking walls, and there is a vampire presence not only in town but a large layer near the town. We have our first female Jarl in Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone. She does not have a court wizard unlike other Jarls, but she does associate quite heavily with Fallion, so she kind of does in a way, but it creates an odd dynamic that doesn't seem to serve her or Fallion well. See, much of the town doesn't trust Fallion, they're very suspicious of him, and this is leading to people becoming suspicious of their Jarl as well. I'm not sure why she doesn't just welcome him into the fold, openly embrace him so that people can trust him a bit more, because as I stated earlier, he is quietly helping protect the town. Beyond that, she kind of seems a bit loopy and detached, but perhaps is a lot more wise and thoughtful than she initially appears. She claims to have psychic visions and dreams, but she cares less for the Civil War and wants to apply focus to her city. I think this is very commendable, especially when we're comparing her to the previous Jarls we've discussed. She is the best by far, I think at least. She doesn't seem to be corrupt, and her focus genuinely seems to be on her people and her city, which is more than we can say for some other Jarls. When it comes to the community, they're reclusive and cautious of outsiders, they don't trust magic, and they want the wizard Fallion to leave, and oddly enough, this is the only city in Skyrim with no shrines. For potential work, they have a deeply lacking economy. The lumber mill is the city's only source of trade, and there are no stables, so it costs more to get here, as we've stated previously. And again, I suppose you could start fishing, maybe hunt in the swamp a bit, but that could be really dangerous. On the other hand, given how lacking the town is in trade, I suppose you could take that as an opportunity to open some sort of general store. Maybe if you could work out some sort of blacksmith trade, that's obviously going to be needed in any town. When it comes to weather, this might be one of the worst locations. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of you might really hate the idea of living in some frostbitten land, but this place isn't warm either. It's a very cold, muggy swamp. Technically, it's a marsh. Apologies for conflating the two, they shouldn't be used interchangeably here. Nonetheless, it's a very inhospitable and dangerous area, very easy to go missing here, whether that be wildlife or vampires. So let's go ahead and rank Morthal. Man, I didn't realize how poor of a state some of these towns were truly in. The realities of Morthal are having me reconsider our placements here. So Morthal, given that it's under attack, or at least currently infiltrated by a vampire and has Morvarth's lair just to the northeast a bit here, it's really in a lot of danger. Their isolation isn't to their benefit, they could be wiped out or under attack and nobody would be close enough to know. It's not too dissimilar from Markarth. They have an external threat that has infiltrated their town in some way and become an internal threat. I think what we need to do is move Markarth up to D tier, but behind Dawnstar, so technically ranked lower. And then we're going to put Morthal in F tier. There are some redeeming qualities, and I really want this town, this little underdog, to make something of itself, because I do appreciate the honest leadership here and community members such as Fallion, but the negatives can't be ignored. There are no farms here. I'm not sure if it's safe to drink marsh water, but it doesn't seem as clean or nice as some of the springs and nice little ponds in the other towns, and we have absolutely terrible trade. Just to expand upon my reasoning here for moving these around, Markarth is a well-defended city at least. A head-on attack from the Forsworn seems incredibly unlikely, and it would probably fail. They're a danger because they're able to sneak in the town, infiltrate. They clearly have some sort of connections. Morthal is wide out in the open, surrounded by that foggy marsh, and they could be attacked by vampires very easily. This is a supernatural foe who is not far from town, and they don't have a lot of defenses. They have very little ways of dealing with them outside of Fallion the wizard, who the town openly rejects, and if they do succeed in kicking him out, they'll probably be gone within a week. This brings us to the lakeside town of Riften, which it's no secret that this location has a ton of problems. Housing here, we have the Bee and Barb Inn. You also have Beggar's Row, which is a form of slums. And then we have Honeyside, which is a purchasable property, $8,000 upfront, $4,300 to fully furnished and upgraded, bringing it to a total of $12,300. Luckily, Riften does have a decent trading scene. We have 4 shops plus a large marketplace. This includes the Blackbriar Meadery, Elgrim's Elixirs, which is an alchemy shop, the Pond Prawn, which is a general store, and then the Scorched Hammer, which is our town blacksmith. For water, it does sit on Lake Honrich, so this is a decent setup here. For food, of course, you're going to have fishing, and you also have the Snow Shad and Merryfair farms, but these are beyond the walls, not too far away from town, but still outside of those walls. For safety and defense, you're certainly exposed to dragon attacks here, and we have wooden structures that are making up most of the town. Luckily, it sits on a lake, but I think that'll just put out the embers maybe as the town collapses into the lake. Of course, the town does have guards, but it's very clear that they can be purchased because they try and hustle you on behalf of Brynjolf when you enter the town. You're then harassed by a man named Maul, who's the right-hand man of Maven Blackbriar. We'll get to her later. And then you witness Sapphire, a member of the Thieves Guild, harassing a stable hand. So this place is just a mess from the entrance. It's more likely that you're going to be harassed by the guards than protected by them, so ultimately not that useful. And again, you have the Thieves Guild who prey on travelers and citizens alike. They're a huge negative to the city. I'm sure some of you enjoy joining them and see the better half of them playing the game, but if you're just a regular person entering this town, they're a clear negative. It is also noted that deaths are not uncommon in town and fights occur over dropped items, so it doesn't take a lot for these people who are clearly on edge to go at your throat. We have the 3 sentinels, at least. These are a series of guard towers that lead up to the main entrance. When it comes to leadership, we have Jarl Layla Lawgiver, but I'm going to spend the least amount of time discussing this Jarl because she seems to be little more than a figurehead. The real one running the show here is Maven Blackbriar. She is one of the most powerful and corrupt individuals in all of Skyrim. It's even the case that she takes the Jarl position if an Imperial victory occurs. This is a giant negative on the town. If it doesn't serve Maven's interests, it's probably not going to happen in Riften. She doesn't care about the little guy, she doesn't care about the average citizen, she cares about herself and maybe her family to some degree, but she is a blight on the community. Speaking of that community, you do have a bustling city with a strong economy built around the mead making and fishing that's going on, and Maven Blackbriar is a part of that mead making, so she provides some benefit in some way, I suppose, although I don't think that industry is entirely reliant on her existence. And you do have a really dejected populace due to the very clear corruption that's occurring in town, not to mention the Thieves Guild's presence. I should have also mentioned for housing, you have Helga's bunk house, which I guess is an option to you, and then you have the Honor Hall Orphanage, which is probably not an option to you, but I don't know if this speaks to a benefit of the city. I suppose it's a positive that Riften does have a place for homeless children to live, but on the downside, do they just have so many homeless children that they need an orphanage of sorts? We do know that Aventus Aretino, at the very least, isn't from Riften, he's from Windhelm, so it's not entirely to their fault. And then we also have the Ratway, which is an underworld of Riften. Now, this could be a benefit if it was used properly or used to benefit the town, but it's not. Going down there just invites you into a ton of hostility, and then you also have the Thieves Guild down there. In the end, the Ratway is little more than a den of iniquity overflowing into the city proper. Now let's take a look at the potential for work here in Riften. You have the stables. Again, it's a benefit that the city has stables. It means cheaper travel to the city and you could work as a stable hand. You do have Shotter there for that though. Then we have the Riften fishery. You could do some fishing. And then we have the canal that runs through the city. Now currently this isn't in use due to the lack of trade caused by the Civil War. So we can see even a location like Riften that does have decent trade is still being really negatively impacted by that Civil War. And then we also should consider the Blackbriar Meadery, which employs much of the town, but unfortunately I think working for them is a bit of a nightmare. If you talk to one of their employees, he'll mention that if he screws up he could be killed, and 3 people in the past year are sitting at the bottom of Lake Honrich right now. I think there's a lot of opportunity to find work in Riften, but the problem is this overbearing pressure coming down from Maven Blackbriar. Any success you receive from your hard work and your honest work can just be undermined by her or the Thieves Guild at any moment. That's going to have to impact its final ranking, which is unfortunate because I think the weather in Riften is pretty cool. Now, you might not like the overcast aspect of it, but the autumn forest is beautiful and you have a very temperate climate. There's a decent bit to consider here with Riften when we're ranking it. Now, it doesn't have the threats that Morthal or Markarth have on it. It still can be attacked by dragons, so Markarth has that over it slightly, but Forsworn aren't looking to invade the city, so that's a decent plus. but you have the Thieves Guild and Maven Blackbriar here. They're a clear negative. They make it hard to live a decent, honest life. Now, on the bright side, the Thieves Guild isn't looking to kill people left and right. They generally try and avoid that because it brings too much heat their way. On the other hand, I think you could achieve something of a quiet, decent, and perhaps even pleasant life in a place like Falkreath that you can't really get here in Riften, at least not consistently. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this below Falkreath in C tier, but above those other towns. And I know some might be thinking, well, at least there's a purchasable home in this city, unlike Falkreath, but every time you try and save up that money to buy that house, you're probably going to get robbed. Now here we are in Solitude. For housing, you have the Winking Skeever Inn, and then we have the Proudspire Manor, which is going to cost you 25,000 septums up front and an additional 11,000 septums to fully furnish it, bringing it to a total of 36,000 septums. This is the most expensive house in Skyrim, so a bit unfortunate. You're going to have to work a really long time to save up that money. And just for reference, the previous two houses we discussed in Markarth and Riften, these houses cost you 8,000 septums up front just to get in the place. This is a much more expensive house here in Proudspire Manor at 25,000 up front. Luckily, there is a decent bit of trading. We have 5 shops plus a decent marketplace. You have Radiant Raiment, which is for clothing, Angeline's Aromatics for alchemy, Bits and Pieces, which is our general store. We have Fletcher, which is our first archery store, and then we have the Solitude Blacksmith. Now for our water source, we're right next to a river with dock access. For food, we have Catless Farm, so unfortunately we only have one farm for the town, but I'm assuming they're importing a lot of stuff via that dock. For safety and defense, we have the Castle Dower, which is the Legion headquarters. Pretty decent thing to have on site if the town gets attacked by anybody, really. And then we sit on a giant stone arch over the Karth River, and we're surrounded by mountains. It's pretty difficult to attack this place. It has city walls, of course, in fact, a dual set of them on an uphill slope, so for the invaders coming in, they're going to have to fight uphill through 2 sets of walls. It has to be mentioned, though, that many supplies, money, and guards are being put into the war effort fighting the Stormcloaks, and this is also the location of the Wolf Queen, Pelagius, and the killing of High King Torygg, so for some reason, Solitude seems to be the location for a lot of tragic events. And speaking of the killing of King Torygg, who was the previous Jarl of Solitude, we now have Elisif the Fair, his widow. She hands off most of her responsibilities to Falk Firebeard, who is her steward, and she is in a severe grieving process, as I'm sure you could imagine. Her husband was just killed. It's also noted that she's quite dependent on General Tullius and perhaps overtrusts him, which could be a bit of an issue to her people or those living within the town, because his focuses are going to be on the Empire, not on Skyrim and not on its people. Similar to Ulfric, she might be overly focused on the war efforts or even getting vengeance of some sort for the killing of her husband. This is really a bit of an unfortunate scenario. You don't want to aggressively strip power from this widow, but it does seem like it might be best for the town for Falk Firebeard to take over, given he is the one doing a lot of her courtly duties. This would also allow for a situation within Solitude where the Jarl isn't emotionally intertwined in the fight or the civil war, and can perhaps focus a bit more on the people and their needs and let General Tullius and the Empire do the fighting against the Stormcloaks. And I shouldn't say isn't emotionally intertwined at all. I'm sure Falk isn't happy with what happened to Torygg, but I doubt he is as emotionally wrapped up in it as his widow is. When it comes to the community of Solitude, this is the capital of the Empire and the Imperial Legion, and it does have that large, bustling city feel. It's quite different from the traditional Nord city. On the downside, you do have this pompous attitude coming from certain citizens. I don't think many would describe Solitude as a humble location. For the working situation in Solitude, you have a major shipping port run by the East Empire Trading Company, and it's very important to the Imperial supply line. We also have the Bard's College, which you could join. This isn't exactly work, but it's a way to get to work and become a skilled laborer of sorts. Students from the Bard's College are known to find good work all across Tamriel, but it can be pretty difficult to get into the college. We also have the Solitude Sawmill, the Solitude Stables, and the Hall of the Dead. I do want to note that the Solitude Stables are connected to Catless Farm, and they seem to have a workers' quarters set up, so this could be a decent place to go work, but they are outside of the walls of Solitude. And for weather, this is one of the more temperate and sunny locations despite being so far north. I think that's a huge benefit to this location. You probably won't be lacking in vitamin D, to say the least. Solitude is a great city. I'm really having a hard time putting it anywhere near the other cities that we've discussed thus far. I'm going to put it into A tier for now, but perhaps it slides up into S. It would be fitting given its name. The biggest negative for me is that incredibly expensive housing situation, and of course we have a questionable leadership situation, but the other aspects of the city provide it that foundation that it needs to where those things don't have to be overly relevant. Fittingly, we will now judge the home of the Stormcloak Rebellion in Windhelm, the City of Kings. For housing, we have 2 inns in this one, which is quite unique. You have the Candlehearth Hall Inn in the center of town, and then you have the New Nissa's Corner Club, which is in the Dark Elves area in the Grey Quarter. Then you also have a purchasable home in the Hijirim, which costs 12,000 upfront, so less than half of what the Solitude house costs upfront, and then 9,000 to furnish, bringing it to a total of 21,000. So even at its full price, fully furnished, the house in this city doesn't cost as much as the Proudspire Manor does just at the upfront cost. It's also worth noting that the Aretino residence may go up for sale at some point if the kid eventually leaves, so we'll throw that in there as well. The housing situation in Windhelm is pretty great. We haven't had this many options in any of the other cities so far. For trading, we have a pretty decent setup here in Windhelm. We have 3 shops and a marketplace going. You have the blacksmith's quarters, you have the white file for alchemy, and then you have Sodri's used wares, which is a general store. Similar to Solitude, we have a water source in the form of a river that has access via the docks. Pretty good situation there. Then let's consider the food situation, which is actually a lot better than Solitude's. You have the Brandy Mug Farm, the Halalu Farm, and the Hollyfrost Farm. You have 3 farms just outside the city's walls. Really good situation for Windhelm. The safety and defense situation isn't bad either. You have a massive stone wall surrounding the town and a huge bridge that goes across a large gap and the river. You have town guards, but they often avoid the Grey Quarter where the Dark Elves lives. We'll get to that prejudice a bit later. You also have Calixto, who is murdering women in the streets. Big negative for safety and defense, and that brings us back to that home of Hijirim. That is his headquarters. That's where he's doing a lot of the rituals, storing body parts and bones and things like that. So that's a big negative on that purchasable home and a big negative on the defense and safety of living in Windhelm. On the bright side, so much of the town is made of this hardy stone that dragon attacks, as long as you get inside, are relatively well defended from. When it comes to leadership, we have the clear man in charge, Ulfric Stormcloak. He has the use of the Thuum, which is very rare amongst people generally, let alone Jarls, and he doesn't actually tend to the issues of the Grey Quarter. He's too busy with the rebellion. He's initially captured, though, this is worth considering, and nearly beheaded by the Imperials, so whether he gets back or not is largely dependent on Alduin showing up in time, and he's probably more focused on the war than actually tending to his cities. It's not just the Grey Quarter he's likely neglecting the entire thing because he's so focused on becoming High King of Skyrim. And this brings us to the community, and we'll kind of tie these into one discussion with Ulfric and the community at large. You have this being the capital of the Stormcloak Rebellion, and many of the Nords here are very prejudiced towards outsiders. So you have the Dark Elves living in the Grey Quarter, and then the Argonians aren't even allowed inside of the city walls. They're forced to live on the dock and work the dock. Oddly enough, you have High Elves living within normal areas of the city though, so the prejudice is very odd and inconsistent. Not all High Elves are Thalmor, but all Thalmor are High Elves. So why the Nords are okay with living alongside the High Elves, who you think they would conflate with the Thalmor, but not okay with living with Dark Elves or Argonians, is beyond me. The very civil war that they are fighting is hinged on the reality of the White Gold Concordat, which is being imposed on them by the Aldmeri Dominion and the Thalmor. So I don't get why they have this inconsistent prejudice, but it's very clearly a negative on the city. It's only leading to more animosity and strife, and it doesn't speak to the health of this location. Let's move on to potential work. So you could go work on the dock, I suppose. I don't know if that's exclusive to Argonians or they're the only ones willing to do the work and they're forced out on the dock anyway. You do have the East Empire Trading Company down there, but they're in absolute shambles. This isn't surprising at all, and they're being sabotaged by a wealthy family in Windhelm known as Clan Shadowshield. We do have the Windhelm stables you could go work at, and there is a warehouse to work in, though again it's mainly just Argonians working on these docks. You have the Hall of the Dead as well. Maybe you could go there, help out with the bodies that Calixto is providing. Ultimately, I'm not sure how you will be received upon entering Windhelm. What you look like is largely going to have an impact on how you're treated by the people here and what kind of work you're offered. We will get back into that in a moment, but I have to note the weather. It's clearly very cold, very inhospitable here, tons of snow. That's something worth considering. For ranking Windhelm, despite it having many really good aspects to the city, lots of farms, a water source right next to it, a decent amount of trade, we have to remember we're coming into this town as outsiders and they don't like outsiders. We also have to consider that the housing isn't available in Hijirm until you go deal with Calixto. Now, at least you're going into this world with that knowledge that he is the murderer, but you have to find a way to reasonably pin it on him and get the other guards and people in town convinced that he is the one committing the murders. You can't just walk in as an outsider and say, it's this guy. They're probably not going to believe you. So we do have a lot of problems surrounding a town that should be ranked higher, and that's going to hold it back. This one is really difficult to rank. I'm having a hard time thinking through everything, and I think your mileage may vary. So it's fitting to put it in a middle category. So what I'm going to do is put Falkreath up into B tier and slide Windhelm above Riften, but in C tier. I'm willing to hear arguments against that, but the reality is if you're a woman coming into this town, you might get murdered by Calixto, and if you're anybody who doesn't exactly fit the bill of a Nord, you might get pushed into the Grey Quarter, which we can see is a very small section of town. There's not a lot of room left. Now we are at our 8th city of Whiterun, and I'll be upfront, I think this is the one to give Solitude a run for its money. We're going to figure out which of these cities belongs in S tier right now. So for housing, of course, we have the Bannered Mare, but the real boon to this city is Breeze Home. It is only 5,000 septums up front and another 1,800 to get it fully furnished, bringing it to a total of 6,800 septums. This reasonable housing that Whiterun offers is a huge benefit to it. The trading situation of Whiterun is arguably the best in game. You have 5 shops plus a large marketplace. You have Arcadia's Cauldron, which is an alchemy shop. You have Belethor's General Goods, which is, of course, a general goods store. You have the Drunken Huntsman, which is a tavern and a hunting supply shack. You can't actually get a room here, though, so it doesn't count into housing. Then you have War Maidens and the Skyforge for a blacksmith in town, and then, of course, the Whiterun Marketplace. For a water source, you have really nice streams that run all throughout town and eventually down into the plains and into a river. For food, we have tons of farms. We have the Battleborn farm, the Chillfurrow farm, the Pelagia farm, and then the Lorius farm, which is a good bit further away from the city, but I suppose it's close enough and it's worth mentioning. For safety and defense, they are propped up on a hill. You do have a giant attacking the Pelagia's farm whenever you enter, so that's worth considering, and they also have that camp nearby. It is open to dragon attacks. Being on a hill doesn't really help you in that regard. You do have large wooden and stone walls all around the town, but it's noted that the fortifications are considered archaic by contemporary standards, so it doesn't have the best setups maybe compared to places like Solitude or Windhelm. Now, it is considered very strategically important to both sides of the Civil War, and we know it's the site of a major battle. That's a bit of a negative when it comes to the safety and defense, but on the bright side, it's home to the companions. They are werewolves, but they're good-natured ones, and they will definitely help defend town in a time of need, so big benefit there. And I'm not saying that they're going to get involved in the Civil War, I mean other external threats, of course. For leadership, here I think we have the best Jarl in the entire region. Balgruuf the Greater is somebody who is deeply conflicted on picking a side with the Civil War. He doesn't want to get involved, and he wants to focus on his people. He's an honest man, he's decent, there doesn't seem to be any situations with corruption. Sure, there's some weird things going on with his kids, but I'm not going to judge his personal life too much. Him as a leader, he does good for his people, and he has a good head on his shoulders. For the community, we largely have traditional Nordic living. It's simple, it's a bit harsh, and it's rooted in ancient ideas. This place was once considered Skyrim's equivalent to the imperial city of Cyrodiil, but recent events have damaged it. This includes the Civil War, harsh winters, and bandit and frost troll attacks, oddly enough. You also have the reality of 2 opposing dynastic families of the Battleborns and Greymanes. The Battleborns support the Legion and they are very wealthy. The Greymanes support the Stormcloaks and are more modest, not poor though. For potential work, this is the commercial heart of Skyrim. It's a central location, allowing it to be one of the most successful trading cities, and we can see this. You also have the Honningbrew Meadery, which is the only real competition to the Blackbriar Meadery. Not necessarily a good thing. I don't know if you'd want to work for them. It might put you in the wrong person's crosshairs. Of course, you have the Whiterun stables, you have the various farms around town. I think there's a lot of opportunity to make yourself useful in this community. When it comes to weather, surprisingly, as I mentioned earlier, it has excessively harsh winters. This is something we don't see in game, but it's a reality you'll have to deal with as the seasons pass. It sits right on top of the tundra plains, so you can have the farms sit around, but then obviously when cold winds come through, you might get some bad storms. Ultimately, I think the weather is better here than in places such as Windhelm, Dawnstar, and Winterhold, which we will get to next, but it's less temperate than places like Falkreath, Riften, or Solitude. This one is really difficult to decide because Solitude has so many beneficial realities of it. I think Solitude is probably the most well-defended city outside of maybe Markarth, but we know its issues there. So in terms of just being a safe place to live, Solitude is hard to beat. On the other hand, Solitude and its economy are deeply tied to the Empire, so you're really reliant on their success, which seems to be in a downward trend as of late. I also really appreciate the small city, big town vibe of Whiterun, and I think you're in better hands when it comes to leadership. Jarl Balgruuf is set on helping his people. That's where his priorities are. But the aspect that is going to put Whiterun into S tier above Solitude is going to be the incredibly affordable housing. We are talking 1/5 the cost for Breezehome over Proudspire Manor. It might be a more humble abode, but at least you'll be able to purchase it. I'm not sure how any of us are going to get into the royalty that is Proudspire Manor within a reasonable amount of time, especially if you're paying for a tavern every night, which is going to stack up in costs. Feel free to debate that and challenge me, say why Solitude should be an S tier. You also might just prefer another one of these towns, let's say Falkreath. You think it would be cooler to live there. You don't necessarily need to say that it is S tier and it's above Solitude and Whiterun given all of the amenities those towns have, but you might just prefer to live in a place like that. This brings us to Winterhold, which feels like an afterthought of a town, but let's get into it and see how it stacks up. Maybe it can stay out of F tier. So for housing, this is the only city in the game where no home is for purchase or property. You can't even buy a property like you can in Falkreath, Dawnstar, or Morthal. You do have the Frozen Hearth Inn, and I'm sure you won't have a hard time getting a room there because that place is empty, and maybe you could get a room at the college if you're allowed entry. That'll sort of be a topic as we discuss this town. And then finally, maybe you could rebuild one of the destroyed homes in town. That's an option too as well. For trading, we have one shop. Luckily, it is a general store with Birna's oddments. This is another place without a blacksmith, and it's the only city without an alchemist. It is right next to the Sea of Ghosts, but it's so far removed from it, overlooking it on a cliffside, so no, this place doesn't really have a water source, I guess, unless you're melting the snow. For food, there's no clear or apparent source of food either. They're so far down from those ice caps and the tundra down below. I suppose they could try and go down there, hunt for some horkers, but that's a major hunting trip. We don't have any direct or clear access to food. Really bad. For safety and defense, this town is not well defended at all. You don't have much in the way of walls. The guards don't have shields for some reason. This is the only town where that is the case. And then most of the town fell off the cliff's edge in an event known as the Great Collapse. Now, it is a benefit to have the mages at the college here in and around the town. I suppose they could help defend it, but they're also considered by many in town to be the reason or the cause of the Great Collapse, so their benefit in safety and defense might have a bit of a positive negative side to it. Their experimenting and what they do and what they involve with the town might bring more danger, and we can see that in some of the quests. For leadership, we have Jarl Corir. Other Jarls of Skyrim have come to disregard this poor guy for some reason, perhaps due to Winterhold's irrelevance. He doesn't seem proud of his city at all, and he's quite dejected, so the leadership situation here is terrible. For the community, we have a really sad state of affairs here. It's quite empty in town, and this was once a great city, relevant and rivaling Solitude, but it's heavily damaged again due to that great collapse event where much of the city was destroyed and knocked off into the Sea of Ghosts. The townsfolk that do remain are very suspicious of the College of Winterhold, but if they could work together in some way, it might benefit the location. The population is greatly reduced and continues to shrink, and you also have dark elves who were driven out of the city by Nords after the Great Collapse and Red Year events, though many stayed in the college, so you also have a bit of that Nordic prejudice going on. For potential work, you have no stables, no farms, barely any businesses or people to work for or who could pay you. It's a really bad working situation. There's really not a lot of an economy going on in Winterhold, and when it comes to weather, I mean, very clearly one of the most, if not the most inhospitable towns in game. Now, I know many of you are probably thinking, what about the college? I'll go live in the college, I'll live out my Harry Potter dreams. Think about the college, but you have to be able to pass a test to even enter the college. You're gonna have to figure out how to do magic. You need someone to teach you, which requires you to go to a different location. I don't think you're gonna be able to learn magic here in the town of Winterhold to get into the college, so that affects its ranking. If you have to go somewhere else first, this isn't a place you can just walk into given our context. Beyond that, you have as many destroyed buildings in town as you have functional ones. This place is in a terrible state. Here's what I think an honest reality, an honest attempt at living in Winterhold right out the gate looks like. You enter town, you look for work, you can't find it, you try and stay at the inn, but you can't afford to pay your rent at the inn, you get kicked out. Maybe they pity you and let you live there, but maybe you just end up stuck outside and freezing to death, or trying to leave town and getting mauled by a bear. With that being said, I have a hard time putting Winterhold above any of the other towns despite the dangers in Morthal and Markarth. I think you're in a terrible situation here. One dragon attack and this place is wiped out. If you want to make the argument that you're going to go off, learn how to do magic, come back, get into the College of Winterhold and have a cool, interesting experience there, that's fine. You can resituate Winterhold based on that, but given our situation, given our context, upon entering the city, you're in a bad situation from the gate. Everyone living here seems to be in a bit of a dire situation as is, so F tier it is. And that's our final list. We have Whiterun in S tier, Solitude in A tier, Falkreath in B tier, Windhelm and Riften in C tier, Dawnstar and Markarth in D tier, and then Morthal and Winterhold in F tier. I'm gonna head back to West Side and turn this report in. Let me know what you think of the list, and I'll see you in the comments.